Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar in the Advancing a Critical Health Service Psychology webinar series. This Codapart grant-funded series is a joint endeavor between APA Division 17, Counseling Psychology, 16, School Psychology, and 12, Clinical Psychology. My name is Dr. Terrell Taylor. I'm an assistant professor of counseling psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and I serve as chair of the webinar series. During today's webinar, feel free to ask questions throughout our session using the Q&A feature. We'll answer these at the conclusion of the presentations, but please note we may not be able to get to all questions. For those seeking continuing education credits, remember that you must participate using a computer, laptop, or tablet, as participation through smartphones does not allow Zoom to track attendance, which could impact your eligibility. Within 3 weeks of today's event, the Society of Counseling Psychology Continuing Education Chair will email links to both the evaluation survey and the CE Certificate of Attendance. Today's webinar is titled Advancing Toward a Critical Health Service Psychology, Accreditation, and Competence Models. This webinar will highlight the importance of adopting a critical health service psychology approach at the accreditation level, emphasizing anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and decolonizing methodologies in training and practice. First, we will have Dr. Lali McCubbin, a member of the APA Board of Educational Affairs, discuss the urgency of this shift, followed by Drs. Ashley Ramclam, Andrése Pérez-Rojas, and Allison Ponce, members from the APA's Board of Educational Affairs and Board of Professional Affairs, Joint Task Force on Doctoral Competencies in Health Service Psychology, who will present an updated competency recommendations for doctoral graduates in health service psychology. To start things off, please allow me to introduce Dr. Lali McCubbin. Dr. McCubbin is a professor of chair at the University of Kentucky in the Department of Educational, School, and Counseling Psychology. Dr. McCubbin is an indigenous multicultural scholar whose research interests and expertise include resilience and well-being among indigenous peoples and people of color, cultural identity development, decolonization and psychology training programs, and stress and coping processes related to trauma. Please welcome Dr. McCubbin.
Mahalo. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen quickly. Hopefully. Can you see that? Hopefully. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about transformational change and HSP education and training, and addressing the question, where are we now? First of all, ekomomai, which means welcome. Welcome to this space. Welcome for taking the time out of your busy day to watch this webinar. And I appreciate all of you being here. For the agenda for my presentation, I'm going to be just talking a little bit about the overview, my positionality in relation to these factors. Where have we been? Where are we now? And where do we go next? The overview is I'll be talking about the key initiative and events within APA community to reiterate our commitment to anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and decolonizing approaches to psychological training, education, and practice, disrupting the status quo in these processes, and also highlight the current tensions and contexts that impact APA, education, mental health, and our communities. And how do we move forward towards collective compassion and empathy, support, and coalition building for the preservation of our well-being? First of all, it's important to talk about my positionality. I'm not going to be talking about my positionality from a Western perspective, but rather from a Kanako Iwi, from an indigenous perspective. My positionality and what I speak today is my mana'o. Mana'o means, mana means life force or life energy or essence, and the mana'o is the breath of life. So here my voice is I am giving breath to my voice to you. That is my positionality. My positionality as an indigenous person, as a Kanako Iwi, and expressing my mana'o comes from my mo'olelo. This comes from my family. This comes from my ancestors. This comes from the land in which I come from. My positionality as an Indigenous person comes from my ahupua pua'a. What that specifically means is as a Native person, my positionality is where is my ocean, where is my mountain, and where is my valley. So as you see on the right, this is a different perspective of Diamond Head. And my mountain is Diamond Head, the ocean is a Pacific Ocean, and my valley is actually on the backside of this crater, because that is where my ancestors, that is where my family is buried. Additionally, down below is a picture of Molokai. Molokai is the island where they had a leper colony, where that my great uncle is buried and who my dad is named after. The island of Molokai in this particular settlement is known because they took Native people and pushed them off the ships, and they had to climb up the cliffs of the mountain to get to the valley in order to survive and be part of the colony. So that is my mo'olelo, and that is my positionality. And those are the stories and the context and the voice that I bring today. Additionally, I center myself in Lokahi. Lokahi is the balance and harmony to my ancestors and my gods, to my humankind, and to the Aina, the land. Additionally, my identity is as a healer. What my voice here is not, but I do hold positionality in the profession, but I speak from my mana'o. I am a professor and administrator. I'm a member of the Board of Educational Affairs. I'm a member of APA and various divisions. I'm also a member of the Society of Indian Psychologists, and I am a member of the Asian American Psychological Association. One of the things that I'm constantly thinking about is the DEI and thinking about the I and what does the I stand for. From a colonial mindset, we talk about the inferiority or the invisibility. This is very clear for Indigenous people, and it's even more clear for Pacific Islanders as not being included as Indigenous people of the US. So with that inferiority and visibility, I show some propaganda and pictures. This is the Japanese internment camp on Honolulu, which is where my grandmother was to go and ended up back on Molokai. This is the propaganda about the recalcitrant children from Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, as well as the Philippines, as part of our infantile ways, and the Indigenous people in the back as part of the US nation. But also to think about the decolonization, thinking about what does it mean for inclusion? What does it mean for Indigenous people to hold space in this inclusion? And what does it mean for Pacific Islanders? And this is a picture of my grandfather. It is the only surviving picture we have. He died at the age of 45. And my father is the first man to live past the age of 45 in my family. We all know the colonial foundations of APA. G. Stanley Hall, who's considered the founder of APA, even did research on Native Hawaiians. He referred to Native Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli as suffering from ignorance, weakness of character, and idleness. That we are lacking control, morally inert, and sluggish, and we're like infants, and we do not know hardship. Additionally, that the only way to strengthen our race was to change the natives' mental abilities was through interracial marriage. Those of mixed race, according to G. Stanley Hall and eugenics movement, was that they are higher on neuroses, and research found that Native Hawaiians and part Hawaiians were 70% suffered from intellectual disabilities. I myself, when I was born, was diagnosed with an intellectual disability because of my racial makeup. So the call for decolonization has been loud and clear and has been going on since time immemorial. One of the recent efforts has been the seminal report by Division 45, Protecting and Defending Our People, A Warrior's Path. And it talks about the roots of colonialism in APA and what colonialism is. And that's that pervasive societal policies that retain authority over marginalized racial communities that impose dominant cultural and sociopolitical practices. And we need to think of how colonialism can still be pervasive, even with good intentions within APA and our various institutions and structures, including our government. This report talked about the barriers in APA that favor the status quo. And what most importantly was the call to decolonize and dismantle the Eurocentric colonial structures and practice in APA and to move towards healing, representation, committed action, even in accreditation and consultation. Key events within APA have been the apology to the people of color in 2021. In addition, was the EDI framework that was published in 2021, and also a racial equity action plan in 2022. The figure depicted is the EDI framework that was published by APA. In addition, and I was a part of this, there was a Council of Chairs of Training Councils meeting in 2020, and we had an important call, the call for transformational change. And for 2 years, 144 psychology educators worked together, including people on the previous webinar and people in this panel as well today, to address the health-related disparities, social injustice, systemic racism, and the unmet mental health needs of our community. With that, we created a CCTC social responsiveness toolkit and had these different areas going from diversifying the HSP pipeline to program structures, to transforming curriculum, to even social justice, community engagement, and lifelong learning. Additionally, a special issue was published in the training and education in professional psychology related to this important work. It should be noted that this Council of Chairs and these team workforces included counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, and school psychologists, and included those in master's and doctoral education, internship, and postdoc positions. With that, there was a task force to create the competency framework for master's and doctoral degree education and training that has gone through several reiterations. And the final product was called the guidelines, or is called the guidelines for competency framework. This went through various committees, went through the APA governance, and recently the vote was passed by BEA and BPA, and that this current document for guidelines for a competency framework is being put forth to the Council of Representatives actually next week. With that, this is just a snapshot of that competency framework. I want to show you that the core competencies are science, knowledge, and theory, EDI, social justice and human rights, relationships and leadership, population health and systems, and ethical, legal, and regulatory decision-making. That makes the flower, the internal flower of the core competencies. The ring on the outside are the professional functions, which is assessment and training, psychological advocacy, education, training, and supervision, research and program evaluation, business, technology, innovation, and intervention and consultation. This slide has the core competencies and specifically the definition. In this document of the competency framework, there's a definition for the core competencies. There's a definition for the functions. There is also goals within that. And also depicted are the benchmarks or the aspirational goals in the master's level and at the doctoral level in this document. So this is just the definitions of these core competencies that this document has, from understanding and applying theories, and specifically integration of diverse epistemologies. The number 2 is understanding privilege, power, and oppression based on the diverse cultural identity factors that they serve. And consistent with social justice involves engaging behavior that values diversity, specifically by treating all groups and individuals with respect, worthiness, equality, basic rights, and prospects. relationships and leadership, including based on identities, culture, context, and needs, looking at the improvement of health and health equity, safety, and well-being, as well as the code of ethics and the applicable laws and regulations. So where are we now? So we have this movement in terms of the master's and doctoral competency framework, which the next presenters will articulate more and speak to their experiences. But now I move to the standards of accreditation. The standards of accreditation recently went through a third revision of the standards. This third revision focused on modifying the language to make clear that all programs are expected to engage in affirmative efforts to foster EDI. They added the following statement: accredited programs train individuals to understand the significance of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and prepare individuals to work in diverse settings with diverse populations. They also made a modified edit to go not only from understanding to actual action, actionable to foster, to demonstrate commitment to fostering equity, diversity, and inclusion, and undertaking concrete efforts to create and maintain culturally responsive learning environment. So for me, the true test as we talk about standards of accreditation and we talk about the competencies framework is to think about my eyes, my inclusion, Indigenous, and Islanders. Are we there? Are we represented? And in the last 3 weeks, I have been holding a great amount of space, which isn't unique to me because of my different identities, the strange pressure points and tensions that exist. And I draw from Audre Lorde. For the master tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Part of this webinar series is about engaging in critical consciousness and critical awareness and critical psychology. But we need that, but we also need to be reminded that even with this critical awareness, we might find ourselves unwittingly upholding systems of oppression in a self-perpetuating cycle. This has been amplified by the current administration, the executive orders, and the political climate. For myself, living in a red state and anti-DEI legislation coming up actually in this February in our state, and the ramifications and impacts on higher education, as well as the impact regarding NIH and NSF and the terms and things like that, and finding challenging times to how do I express myself as words may be banned or limited or have dire consequences for my communities of color. And so with this, how do I find solace? How do I find community? And how do I find liberation? And with my liberation and my solace comes from work, from decolonial feminist, womanist, Mujerista, and Wahine psychologies. This is where I find that collective voice. It's important in our inclusion that we have Indigenous voices and Pacific Islanders. It's also critically important we engage in the processes of uncolonization first, then decolonization and indigenization. And we have written about this. And also the importance of disrupting the status quo and centering structural competencies in accreditation and in our standards. So where do we go next? We need to engage fully in the process of decolonization. We need to draw from critical studies, including community psychology, Indigenous studies, and decolonial feminist approaches. I'm a Christian and a Buddhist, so I think about not only just empathy, but how do we have collective compassion for human suffering to transcend? And I'm constantly asking that process. And what about coalition building, not only with APA, but with the other organizations that represent psychologists? And how do we expand our horizons to include all mental health professionals and critical perspectives that are happening globally? Thank you for your time. I'll
Thank you.
stop sharing as soon as my mouse. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCubbin. That was really helpful, and I appreciate everything that you just shared with us. I am Jordan Wright. I am the current president of Division 12, the Society of Clinical Psychology, one of the co-sponsors of this webinar series, and I am extremely honored to introduce our next three presenters. These are three of the most dedicated, willing, what is the word for having grit? Gritty? That's not right. But they have invested so much time and effort and brilliance into work that I've gotten to do with them. And they are going to present on some of that work. And I am going to read a few bios so that you know who they are. So Dr. Allison Ponce is a professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. She earned her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Connecticut and completed her postdoctoral training in the Yale Department of Psychiatry before joining the faculty. She's the director of education at the Connecticut Mental Health Center. Dr. Ponce has a research, administrative, and clinical interests in public mental health, particularly with regard to serious mental illness. Another major area of focus is the education and training of psychologists and other mental health professionals. Dr. Ponce is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, is a chair of the EPA's BEA-BPA Task Force on Doctoral Competencies, and a co-chair of the Association of Psychology Postdoctoral and Internship Centers, APIC, Standards and Review Committee. She also serves as associate editor of the APA Journal Psychological Services. Dr. Ashley Ramclam is an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine. She's a licensed psychologist and a licensed specialist in school psychology in Texas, and currently works in primary care with Texas Children's Hospital, where she provides brief assessment and intervention services. She also serves on the training team working with pre- and postdoctoral trainees. Her clinical and research focus on increased early access and culturally informed autism services for youth of color. And Dr. Andrés Pérez-Rojas is an associate professor and program director in the counseling psychology PhD program at Indiana University, Bloomington. His primary research interests include the process and outcome of psychotherapy, with an emphasis on measuring and understanding the impact of various cultural processes, such as cultural comfort and cultural humility, as well as structural competency, or the ability to recognize and address how social, economic, and political structures influence health and psychotherapy outcomes. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Ponce, Ramclam, and Pérez-Rojas.
Thank you. Thanks, Jordan. Our slides are coming up here. So again, I'm Allison Ponce. We're going to start with an overview of a project that's an example of an approach that disrupts the status quo. Andres, Ashley, and I, and other people who I see who are here in the audience, including Jordan, worked as part of a fantastic group of colleagues over the past few years to really think deeply about what health service psychologists should be able to do at the end of their training. So we're going to talk about how and why we did our work, present the model that we created, and discuss some of the implications of it. I think the context for how we came together is helpful. So we're going to have a little history lesson to start. So in 2018, the Council of Representatives of APA approved pursuing accreditation of master's programs in health service psychology, or HSP. The APA Boards of Educational Affairs and Professional Affairs, BEA and BPA, convened a task force in 2019 to articulate the competencies for people trained at the master's level. So this master's competencies task force did its work, but it was decided it was important to review and potentially update the doctoral competencies framework as a next step toward delineating master's and doctoral competencies. So in 2021, BEA and BPA commissioned our task force, the Task Force on Doctoral Competencies in HSP, to update the competencies for graduates of doctoral HSP programs, and importantly, to propose other actions the APA could take to consider, take into consideration for distinguishing doctoral and master's training. So we already have our slide up here of who was in this group. We are a group that consisted of several psychologists, and at the time a trainee, Dr. Ramclam, who's no longer a trainee, now a psychologist with us. We represented, as was mentioned before, school, counseling, and clinical psychology. We came from all different career stages and many different career paths in education and practice, as well as beautifully diverse other identities as well. So you can see on here several task force members, liaisons from BEA and BPA, and several staff from APA who supported our work over the course of years. So before we get into a discussion of what we created, as I mentioned before, we think it's important to talk for a few minutes about how we approached our work. And it's relevant because it really informed our product and what the product represents. And I'll say here that while this work was a product of an APA task force, the product is not an APA product and it's not APA policy. So just want to make sure that that is clear. So next slide, please, Andres. So here we are. As I mentioned, we were a group of psychologists coming from very different backgrounds and perspectives, and some of us had met before, most of us were new to one another. So we were very deliberate to try to spend time getting to know one another, to learn everyone's reasons for joining the task force and their hopes and concerns for the process. Next slide, please. We were also really deliberate in setting, here we are having some goofy fun. This is labeled on my computer as task force silliness. So we were deliberate in setting a path for our work with a strong emphasis on finding ways to make sure everyone's voice was included. This involved having conversations about ourselves, our backgrounds, and developing a shared vision for how to proceed with our work. We agreed it was important that there was this goal in mind, which is to revise or redesign the doctoral competencies, but that we needed to prioritize collaboration, broad participation, and thoughtfulness over rushing to produce a product. Next slide, please. So the first major decision point was to set a set of principles for us to guide our work. So we agreed that we would engage a wide range of interested parties in an inclusive and transparent way, that we needed to ground the model in an EDI framework, working toward the elimination of systems that reinforce structural injustice and maintain inequity, that the model should not perpetuate harm to learners or others, including the public we serve, and that the competencies should be used to support trainees and promote empowerment. An additional frame here is that the burden of mental health difficulties is really best addressed when we're working at the top of our education and training and in collaboration with other degree levels, other disciplines and professions. And finally, we decided that our model would not simply be a revision of prior models and should instead focus on what's necessary to effectively reduce the burden of mental health difficulties for decades into the future. So while differentiating master's and doctoral competencies was always on the part of the agenda from the APA boards that commissioned us, it was our stance that we first really needed to develop a model for doctoral and then come together with the master's task force and others to consider the next steps with care, specifically not to reinforce ideas about hierarchy or to take a better than approach or to prioritize doctoral over master's. Next slide, please. So to be as inclusive and gather as many good ideas as possible, we held a series of listening sessions with members of the practice and education communities, initially asking 3 questions, which included how they would suggest we ground the competencies in EDI principles, what their thoughts were on what makes the doctoral degree distinctive from master's in HSP and other mental health service fields, and in thinking of the future of HSP, what should we be preparing psychologists to be able to do? So this open community engagement played a huge role in the development of our model. We talked to hundreds of people who came to all sorts of webinars and connected with us in other ways to offer their opinions on these questions and help us think about what we really needed to be keeping in front of mind as we did our work. And we learned specifically that there was a real need to think about how psychologists do their work, that we shouldn't just focus on the activities that psychologists do. So as we think about a competencies model that can move us into the future, we recognize that there has to be flexibility to add new roles and activities as the needs of society and the profession change. And there are so many different ways to do each kind of psychological activity that it's too restrictive to dictate how each activity should work or look for every doctoral program and every trainee or learner coming through a program. And one of the amazing things about HSP, of course, is the diversity of things we can do and career options. And we really think it's important that training programs and training councils should have flexibility to determine what students should be trained to do in those programs. Next slide, please. So from there, we drafted and redrafted and redrafted and got feedback from all corners. We used a highly collaborative participatory approach within the task force, supported by our liaisons from BEA and BPA. And as I mentioned before, we had Jordan from BEA and then 2 Kathys from BPA who were with us over the course of time. And our liaisons shared information and feedback from the boards back to us and the other direction as well. And we held additional listening sessions with the community to get further feedback on our work at a different stage. So ultimately, our draft model was presented to the 2 boards during the 2024 spring consolidated meetings with the request to go out for public comment to hear from even more members of the community about the model and to revise based on that. Ultimately, that permission actually wasn't granted. The boards then engaged in a subsequent process using some of the ideas from the master's product and the doctoral product, our product, to create a different document, which, as Lali mentioned before, is currently being moved through the APA process, headed to Council of Representatives presently. So while our model is not going to be adopted by APA, we believe it really has merit. It was developed in a very collaborative, open way, and it reframes what HSP competencies can look like and what the emphasis can be. It presents a new way of considering how psychologists should be able to do their work, not just the specifics of the activities of psychology. And while our task force focused on doctoral competencies, we've really come to see our model as applicable to both doctoral and master's levels of training. It really has the potential, we think, to unify HSP, providing much more shared space rather than separation. And so Ashley is now going to walk us through the actual model.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk about our competency model. And again, thank you, Allison, because she set it up very nicely for me. But again, just to clarify, this is not the model that's going to council next week. This is our product that we are really proud of and excited to share with y'all. And so in our model, there are 2 components to that competency model. If you could go ahead and click through for me. Perfect. So the first one being the processes. So the core primary processes that we considered or that we have in this model really underlie all the work that we are doing as HSPs. So this is truly the focus of education and training. As Allison mentioned, this is the focus on how we engage in HSP work. So regardless of client, patient, school, system, et cetera, that we are working with, our approach is truly informed by all 4 of these processes. So important things about that is that our hope is that these are things that are relatively stable, right? As we mentioned, this is sort of core to the identity of HSP. And so these are things that are really relevant and sort of, applicable and important to the work that we're doing now, but also in the future as well. And so that was important to this. And then also these 4 processes are consistently integrated and simultaneously used together across, again, all domains. And then secondly, the other part we have is the domains. So we have identified 6 domains of knowledge and activity that I'll kind of talk about within our model. But it's important to know these are not like definitive, they're not exhaustive. Our goal is that this is the adaptable part of the model, right? That these can shift and change depending on program area, degree level, goals, individual programs, that there's really some flexibility in that. And it also gives a chance for programs, training councils, et cetera, to really revisit and revise these regularly while still maintaining that sort of core foundation within the process models as well. So if you can go to the next slide, perfect. So of course, every model needs a good visual. And so you can see here, we've got our 4 processes, which I'll talk a little bit about. And we wanted to really sort of include it in a way that shows these are all sort of working together, right? We've got psychological science, which again is well aligned with APA stated mission to promote advancement, communication, application of psychological science and knowledge to benefit society and improve lives. And science has been a core component of graduate level training, using psychological science to approach the work that we're doing. That's something that we see kind of, again, being very central to our identity and the work that we're doing as HSPs. Psychological theory, again, fundamental to the field of psychology and the work that we're doing, using that as sort of our planning framework, right? As we are approaching new problems or helping communities, that we are using psychological theory to do that. We know that using theory really improves outcomes. And it was also important part of the conversation for us to also recognize that we want to make sure that we are being critical of the psychological theories that we're using. So acknowledging who developed the theories, in what context, from what worldview, and who is and is not represented within that. And so when we are applying these psychological theories, that we're doing so in a way that is very mindful and deliberate for the particular communities that we are serving. Our EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion principles, that was something, as Allison shared, that was pretty important as a task force for us from the very beginning. And that's something that rang true within our listening sessions and just communicating with other HSP colleagues as well. This is well aligned with APA's commitment to embedding EDI across the organization and the discipline. And so we really found that it was important to, you know, apply these EDI principles in the work that we're doing, and really with an effort to check implicit biases, to you know, acknowledge individual and cultural diversity, while also actively resisting against oppressive systems and structures. Again, with that ultimate goal of sort of improving quality of life, human functioning. And then lastly, we've got our ethics and social justice principles. Of course, we're expected to adhere to and apply our current ethics codes. And it's crucial, right, that we do that now, but also into the future, that we are rooting it into ethical and social justice values and being held accountable to the public as well. So again, these 4 processes altogether are what make an HSP competent under this model. And so if someone is practicing and we are only using 2 or 3 of these things, then that's not true competency within this model the way that it's designed. And then on the next slide, we've got some domains or activities. And so, you know, again, we've really focused on what does it mean to think and process and be an HSP, regardless of the activities that we're doing. So you'll see some that are very familiar and have been included in past competency models, right? And intervention, assessment, research, education and training even. But advocacy, leadership, and administration were 2 that we definitely heard from through our listening sessions as being things that we really see the field sort of moving to. So we wanted to highlight that. But again, these are also just examples, and these are things that programs can sort of individualize, right? So a school psych program might focus more on psychoeducational assessment versus another program that might focus more on some comprehensive psychological or neuropsychological assessments in different ways in how they are teaching and training their trainees. And then on our last slide, we're kind of putting it together to show, again, we are using all 4 of these processes as we are engaged in our work as HSPs. And so I'm going to turn it over to Andreas to talk a little bit more about implications.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. I'm, like Ashley mentioned, I'm going to sort of talk about some implications and reflections, particularly about how this model might represent kind of sort of a critical vision for psychology and HSP, right? And kind of how to think about that as a disrupting the status quo. Again, important to emphasize, you know, we're not speaking for APA, we're not speaking for BEA or BPA, we're not speaking even for the task force that was convened necessarily. You know, these are just some reflections and implications that we are considering, right? You know, that in light of the question of like how to advance towards a critical oriented kind of sort of vision of HSP. But as a starting point, I think our model provides a unifying vision for health service psychology across clinical, counseling, and school psychology. And I think this unifying vision extends across degree levels as well. So while the specific work in each area, right, of counseling, clinical, school psych, right, might differ, how we approach that work, right, through psychological theory and science, EDI principles, and ethical and social justice considerations, that is a shared foundation, right? In other words, I think our model promotes a critical lens across all areas, right? And similarly, while master's and doctoral graduates may engage in different activities, right, different domains, the core elements guiding their work should really remain the same, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't any differences or there won't be differences, right? I think master's and doctoral level clinicians may engage in different domains or activities based on scope of practice. And doctoral trainees may even have greater opportunities to apply even the core processes in more depth, right? However, I think the core elements remain the same, right? All degree holders should receive meaningful education and training in integrating psychological theory and science, EDI, and ethical and social justice principles. I think this model also stands apart from the one currently being proposed by APA and considered by the Council of Representatives, right? There's a lot of similarities, as you may have seen with the different graphics, we know with all the overlapping circles and things like that, right? But I think one important distinction is I think there is a push, I think, within the profession, within psychology, HSP, APA, to differentiate masters and doctoral graduates kind of on every dimension of their work, right? Including those core competencies. And I think that the way that that often comes across and the way that often is framed is almost hierarchical, right? And we just sort of categorically, from the beginning, as Allison pointed out, we kind of rejected that notion, right? And we still do. We still reject this notion that a so-called multi-tiered profession means doctor at the top, masters at the bottom, with the expectation that master's graduates will somehow serve or be subordinate to those with a doctorate, right? I think that vision is abhorrent and inconsistent with the values of the profession, right? Instead, we have argued, our model kind of sort of solidifies this view that all graduates, regardless of degree level, should approach their work through this more critical integrative lens, right? One that considers, like Ashley just walked us through, the psychological theory and science alongside EDI and ethical and social justice principle. Again, sure, there may be differences between master's and doctorate, right? But these should not really extend to what we teach them when it comes to these core competencies, right? And we shouldn't put up barriers for people with a master's degree to be able to enjoy the benefits of a graduate education in health service psychology, right? By sort of being so rigid and delineating differences where differences shouldn't really exist, right? So again, our model provides a strong foundation and a unifying vision for the profession, right? One that values the contribution of all degree holders. Now, I've been mostly focusing on the process competencies because in many ways, I think we see that as the real innovation in training models. But I think a domain that is worth sort of highlighting, right? That even if we say that training councils and programs may have flexibility in what domains to impart or activities to sort of teach in, etc. But I think a domain that's worth highlighting here is advocacy, right? Because this is not just advocacy for our clients or the organizations we consult for, or even the profession of psychology, right? That advocacy is very important, but we're talking here about advocacy for social change, right? Advocacy for, to address structural issues, advocacy to support or enhance population health. That's really important. That's something that came up again and again in our listening sessions, in conversations with various interested parties. And it's something that we as a profession must embrace if we are really advancing towards a critical vision for HSP, right? I don't think we won't live up to the principles of anti-racism and anti-oppression that APA has committed itself to without this in some ways, right? So I think it's really important to think about legitimizing advocacy skills as part of skills of psychology, right? Now, I think the process of developing the model also holds important lessons for advancing a more critical psychology in accreditation and training, right? We work within a system that held a very different perspective from our task force's vision, right? And here I'm sort of speaking more from my experience, my own positionality, right? But many folks, within APA, we're not really shy to pointing out, what we were doing, right? Throughout, we faced resistance, a lot of pushback that our approach was too different, questions about why change was even really necessary, and challenges framed in some really interesting ways, like, oh, would this really pass muster in this particular state or university or jurisdiction? Or does this promote intellectual diversity? Or, you know, with that we must limit advocacy to psychological advocacy, right? In other words, advocacy only for the science, research, and education of psychology, you know, and that we couldn't really sort of focus on what psychologists do outside of the work setting, right? And what sustained us through that resistance, through those challenges, was our commitment to those core principles that that Allison outlined earlier, right? You know, leading with an EDI lens, rejecting harmful and exclusionary models, and striving for really meaningful change rather than just minor revisions to past frameworks. Now, the model, you know, so the model was developed through a collective, inclusive process, right? I think incorporating many different perspectives, right, from within the task force, but also listening sessions, consultations with various boards. It really was a pluralistic effort, right? I think that stands in sharp contrast with efforts that give way to one constituency within psychology over another. You know, I find it hard to believe that that's really a critical way of doing things. But we also had to accept, right, that even if our final model was ultimately going to be overridden or not really taken up by, you know, the system, given sort of different special interests, that we would continue advocating for this vision, right? Like Allison said at the top of our presentation, you know, like this is something that we came to really believe in, and that I think has value for how we think about training and accreditation, et cetera, right? The integrity of the work matters, right? Even if it gets squashed or it doesn't get taken out, right? So the process wasn't perfect, nor was it without any challenges, but it was grounded in a shared vision for a psychology that can credibly respond to the realities of today, right? And again, speaking here for myself, right? But I think we in APA and health service psychology, we can either be a world-class organization that does everything to prepare psychologists to make the world a better place, or we can be another institution that recreates the divisions and hierarchies in our society, and you know that cowers in the face of the challenges ahead. You know, we chose the former, right? A vision for how we can prepare psychologists to engage not just with their clients or with other psychology or mental health professionals, but with the communities and the systems that we're part of. And I hope that we can continue to move towards that vision, right? Towards a more critical psychology. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
I'd like to send a special thank you to all of our presenters for your contributions and really helping us understand the importance of advancing a critical health service psychology by adopting a graduate training competency model that's rooted in critical consciousness, decolonization practices, as well as just your meaningful engagement of helping us think about ways in which our training programs can continue to move things forward. As a quick reminder, attendees will receive an email with an evaluation link and a certificate of attendance for CE credits within 3 weeks of today's presentation. But for now, we will shift to doing a brief question and answer session that'll be led by myself and Dr. Melanie Wilcox. If you have not already done so, please feel free to send in your questions using the Q&A button that you see there on your screen. And to start us off, Dr. Wilcox, how about you get us started with the first question?
Sure, absolutely. And really briefly, before we jump into questions, and I hope that more folks will add them in the Q&A, I just want to echo the thank you to our presenters today and for the hard work that all of you have put in, not only to your presentations today and your comments, but all the work that came before this. You know, Andre spoke to this a little bit, but I think just as important to uprooting the colonial and white supremacy roots of psychology is to look not only at content, but also process, right? And so when we are engaging in processes that reify the ways that white supremacy works and the way that we uphold these systems of oppression, then that in and of itself must be interrogated regardless of where the content lands. And I was thinking a lot as folks were talking about the room where it happens from Hamilton, right? That so many things happen in rooms that we never get to see. We never get to know what the processes are. And I would argue that that is another way by which white supremacy gets upheld. And so I am grateful for the opportunity today to shed even just a little bit of light on some of those processes. And I'd like to remind us that it is as important to interrogate the processes by which things happen as it is to interrogate how white supremacy pervades our content as well. So that said, I will get us started off with the first question. And I'll start with some of the shorter ones and a time-sensitive one. One person asked and said thank you to our amazingly brilliant presenters and hosts. How do we continue this advocacy and possibly influence standards of accreditation to move in this direction? Who would like to get us started?
Sorry, you're asking me, sorry.
I'm asking whoever would like to get us started.
I appreciate this question, and I think that we need to continue to push. We need to continue our advocacy. I think that I can't speak for the Commission on Accreditation or the standards of accreditation. I also, though, want to articulate that processes and underlying that, I think that we may be giving a lot of power to a Commission on Accreditation. When the power lies with us in terms of defining those standards, that it is our collective body, that our power is within our membership, with them amongst each other. And so that's one thing that I've been really conscious of, even within APA and even within our nation. How much power am I willing to give up? How much power am I willing to give to another person or another entity, and how can I also take my power back? And with that, some of the seminal work and even that the new TEP call for papers, I think, is part of that process in advocating and ensuring that our collective voices are heard.
I know this isn't a question in the Q&A, but I actually wonder, Mel or Jordan, if one of you would talk about the call for papers, because I think that might help frame a way that we can continue advocating for this work.
You want to do that, Mel?
Sure, I can start us off. So Jordan and I are co-editing a joint special issue of Training and Education in Professional Psychology and Professional Psychology Research and Practice, lots of acronyms and letters. And our focus is on sort of reacting to these two competency models before us with a particular eye toward what needs to change for us to move toward a more critical, anti-racist, anti-oppressive health service psychology. And so we're really hoping to hear from folks, not only your reactions to the competency models before us, but where do we need to go from here? You know, and if we're going to dreamcast, right? What would an anti-racist, decolonized, anti-oppressive psychology look like? What would the competencies of those psychologists look like on the education and training side and on the practice side for each respective journal? So I hope that folks will consider, you know, submitting abstracts to Jordan and I to further dreamcast with us.
And I think that sort of gets to, I hope it's okay to jump in, Mel. I think it sort of gets to some of the questions that we're seeing in the Q&A about what do we do? How do we keep moving forward? And Stuart asked a very pointed question about council next week. That's a question I can't answer, but I'll be curious for people's thoughts. But continuing a conversation is what feels important here. So when our model got turned back or stopped or whatever last spring, one option would have been to say okay, well, we put a lot of time into this, but it's not going anywhere. We're done. Goodbye. And instead we said, this is actually really important. we actually think this has a lot of value, that it really could be transformative. We're going to keep stepping forward with it, which is why in a whole year later, we're here again, still talking about this. And so I think one of the important points is just to continue discussing and moving. What is going to happen in council next week? I don't know. Whether our model's ever going to be adopted any place officially, I don't know. But I think that each of us as educators and practitioners can think about what this model means, can think about what it could do, can think about the way we can discuss and be really concerned about how we're doing our work. Are we always leading with psychological science? Are we leading with psychological theory? Are we thinking about ethics and social justice? Are we thinking about EDI in everything we do, regardless of what we are doing? That's a way to keep this alive. That's a way to undo what's been done before and to keep moving forward in a positive new direction. And so whether this actually ever goes anywhere, officially, I don't know. But each of us can incorporate it into our work.
Absolutely. For context, I want to restate the question to make sure that everyone understood and see if there are other thoughts to it. But given the differences between, the model that we learned about today and the one that's being voted on in council next week, what will the approach be next week? So I'm not sure if other folks really have different thoughts about this. I know some of it may be unknown, but want to invite other voices.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer a question of like what's the approach going to be, because the council representatives will do what they do, and they have access to information and conversations that some of us in this room don't have access to. And so what I would hope, though, that happens next week in council is that there would be, as Mel said, a real two things. One, some consideration, some thoughts, some conversation around how did this model can come to be before us, right? Was the process by which that model came to be before us like appropriate? Was it something that really reflects the values and practices and best practices of our profession and us as an organization, right? In many ways, I mean, folks have been sort of sharing documents about sort of APA being in crisis. So there's a lot of questions around, the way APA is or isn't working, right? I think this is of a piece with that conversation, So my hope is that people in council, and again, I speak for myself, and as a member of two divisions in APA, and someone who's exercises, membership in the profession, that will be part of the conversation, right? And that will be part of the consideration and something that people keep in mind as they consider this. And then, to the question of, and then number two, that they would consider the content, right? And the content differences between the two models are there, and they are important, My hope is, that the model that is before the Council of Reps went through a public comment period. My hope is that, members of council will actually have like a document of some sort that walks people through, like, here are the comments that we received, and here are the ways that we responded to it, and here are the changes that we made, and here's how it differs from the recommendations of the task force and things like that, But barring that, I think there are some important differences, and that people will question, like one important one that Allison mentioned is, again, how do we treat people with a doctorate versus people with a master's degree? I think that's a really big, important one. Does the model that whatever model it is that becomes official APA policy is it one that really is going to uphold the value and contributions that all psychology trainees, whether doctorate, graduate, master's or doctorate, like hold? I think that's something else that's important. I'll shut up now.
I appreciate that, Andres, and I think it's another reminder, and for me, a call to action that I hope that we all understand at this point the importance of participating in our own governance out in society, out in the world, right? But it's just as important that we participate in our own governance within the association. We have a gigantic governance structure, and we have a voice through that governance structure. And, that includes speaking to your own council reps, if you're a member of a division, if you're a member of a state or provincial psychological association, you have representation in council. So you can certainly speak to those folks. You can also run for those offices. And so it's just a reminder that it's really, really important, both working with governance and also running for governance, because important policy happens within these bodies. So I know we have a couple of questions related to the current political climate, and I'm not ignoring those. We're trying to answer those comprehensively together and save some time for that. So before we go there, I'm first going to address this other question, which is actually about the master's pushback, which I appreciate because I see this regularly. I think a lot of us do. The person notes that they love the idea, they love the framework and its rejection of the hierarchy between master's and doctoral degrees and degree holders. But, what guidance or resources do folks have for how to talk to faculty in master's programs, or argue faculty at all, our own colleagues all over the place, about the pushback, noting that faculty typically have doctoral degrees, and, folks push back against the idea of a lack of hierarchy between the master's and doctoral degrees. So what readings, resources, other approaches can help people critique their own assumptions on this?
So this isn't a full answer to the question, but I think what's been helpful in several conversations I've had about this is taking the giant step backward to say, what are we trying to do here? Like, as a profession, what are we interested in? And if it's true that we're interested in relieving the burden of mental health concerns, thinking about a more equitable and just approach in the world, thinking about the way structures maintain problems and are in large part to blame for what's going on for individuals. Lali and Celeste Malone and Amy Reynolds wrote a wonderful paper about sort of thinking about accreditation from this frame, and really outline in that paper that the ways that we really need to be thinking differently about structural issues in our field, which we've all talked about in this space as well. But if we can take the step back and say the reason master's programs are being accredited is to increase access to care. There are other reasons too, I know, but the goal is that we're all moving toward trying to relieve the burden of mental illness and structural problems that maintain problems. That hopefully can be a frame for people to say, okay, so it's not so much about me versus them, or my paycheck versus their paycheck, or any of the other things that I think get in the way of us really being able to think in an equitable way about who we are as a profession. I hope that can help be a frame. Coming from that perspective might help people be more open to thinking about why that hierarchy doesn't help anybody, actually, in my perspective. And I know other people on this screen probably have other thoughts about it too.
I think, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask for others. Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say I've been getting involved in my state association, particularly about the master's level and the doctoral level. And the reality is the people in my communities, in the Pacific Islander communities and Indigenous communities and in Black communities, they're served by master's level clinicians. And I've even been in state meetings where they're like, well, there's no psychologists that work with X, Y, and Z community, a Black community, lower SES. And I'm sitting here, I'm a psychologist, I work in that community, but you just rendered me invisible. And so with that, when we look at the state, is the state really like a guild to advocate for the doctoral people to have these jobs and have that lion's share? Or is the state associations about the welfare and the mental health of our states, of our cities, and our rural populations? And so I really have to make sure that I'm at that table to kind of interrogate that notion of this isn't about a guild and protecting our profession. It's about serving our state. It's about serving our people. It's about serving our communities.
I think I would add to that, it was mentioned at the beginning, my background is school psychology, and school psychology is a field where the majority of practicing school psychologists in schools are at the master's level. And I think our, like the National Association of School Psychologists, with our competencies and everything within NASP and the programs that they're accrediting, sorry, I cannot talk today. It is pretty consistent, right? There is not this big differentiation between doctoral versus master's or specialist level. And I think that it has been a really nice big benefit to the field of school psychology. And I think something that I hope is sort of seen in clinical and counseling psychology a little bit more as well. Because like we've mentioned, or, my colleagues on this panel, it is important to think about how are we getting the services to the families, the children, the adults that need them best. And we know that they are being served by a large portion of master's level clinicians. And I also think that there's a piece to this that is important in educating trainees and prospective students as they're entering the field, and really having an important conversation of, what are our ultimate goals and what is the best path for them, and really feeling like, I hope that as we are hopefully kind of creating this shared unifying identity as HSPs, that we also can empower folks to really go after what they want without feeling bad one way or the other, right? Or not feeling like this is out of reach for me for whatever reason. And so that we can all just collaboratively work together. So I think some of those conversations and kind of leaning on each other across program types and things can be extremely helpful in moving forward.
One last thing I'll say is that I think there's also literature that you can point to in terms of, at least in my realm, psychotherapy process and outcome. Well, you'll see that, consistently we're not finding, right, that folks with a doctorate versus a master's degree, or even psychologists versus others, et cetera, we're not seeing differences in client outcomes based on degree type or level of training and things like that, right? And I mean, it's a thorny kind of sort of issue, right? And there's a lot of sort of methodological things to keep in mind, right? But that's actually the last 10 years or so, we keep seeing that, right? Absence of evidence isn't necessarily sort of, proof of something or other, right? But I think it's important to say, right, we do not see differences in important client outcomes when it comes to people who have a master's degree versus a doctorate, right? And I think that's really important. Again, it goes back to the question, that I love how Lali sort of framed it. Are we a guild, or are we an association, state associations or otherwise, that is trying to fight for the public interest, right? So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind as well.
Thank you all. I want to add one reflection to hearing all of your answers that's related to why we're coming together for this at all. And that is that I hope one of the questions that folks take away from this whole series and learn to ask over and over again is, how is white supremacy operating in this situation? And when systems of oppression pit us against one another, it conveniently keeps us from dealing with the actual problems, right? Like when multiple folks have sort of alluded to the fact that there's not a lack of need for mental health services, right? A lot of folks desperately need mental health services. So in theory, it's not like we're all fighting for this same small slice of a pie, right? There's, in theory, plenty to go around. Now, is that materializing for a lot of practitioners? No. But is that because of genuine competition between us? No, it's because of oppressive systems and structures that restrict people's access to mental health care, restrict how much we get reimbursed, under what circumstances we get reimbursed. And instead of fighting all of that, we wind up fighting with each other about who deserves what little bit is being thrown to us. And frankly, that's ridiculous. And if we could come together around our shared values instead of seeing one another as competition, I think it could be really amazing what we could accomplish. But it's really easy to get baited into fighting with one another instead of actually fighting against the oppressive systems that are harming us all and getting us to do things that are ultimately against our own interest, because all the fighting back against master's practice on the part of psychology that's happened for decades has harmed us. And that could be its own separate webinar, walking through the history of that. But the very short version is that it's harmed us. And that tends to be what happens when we get baited into fighting with each other instead of actually fighting back against systems of oppression. Right,
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Mel. I think there was another question that kind of came up related to the competency model that is going before council. And it's really one about, what happens if that model does not pass, and is there danger in slowing the process down? Curious to hear what folks' thoughts are in that regard.
I actually just want to pick up on that very quickly and extend the comments I was just making, which is that, I don't think ultimately it would affect the accreditation, like things would continue on. We've been accrediting without having that competency model in place. Is it ideal? No. Would it make some things difficult? Yeah, that's a great reason why we shouldn't yield to oppressive processes, because ultimately, it tends to backfire in some way, shape, or form. So if we could be patient with thorough processes, kind of like, the difference between doing quick and dirty quant research and doing community-based participatory action research, right? The latter takes a lot longer, but it is a much more social justice oriented, much more equity focused, much more collaborative way to move forward, right? And we get more accurate results for it. The science is better for it. So if we could be patient with equitable and inclusive processes, we would be better for it. When we don't, then ultimately there tend to be consequences, short-term or long-term. And that's what happens when we yield to oppressive processes. Yeah, I don't know what others' thoughts are on the potential consequences.
I think this articulates to the push-pull dynamic in terms of we want to do this right. We want to do this to empower our communities. We want this to liberate our communities, to heal our communities. At the same time, if we're continually waiting for predominantly white processes to approve us to get those resources, my concern for me as an Indigenous person is there's an urgency because people are dying. This isn't just about people are uncomfortable, there's some discord. My people are dying. And so I want to, there's that push pull. I want to do this right. I want to make sure that the voices are centered from the communities that need the most services. But I also am worried about waiting for these processes of democracy that is embedded in that white supremacist process, that it's going to lead to more harm to my people, that I'm going to bury more of my elders. And that's the piece that really, that's that push-pull I constantly feel as a person of color and as a person of mixed race. I think also the piece that this is a little tangential, but it goes somewhere, is Hamilton. We talked about Hamilton. And there's a great Netflix documentary about questions from the past, from people, from youth. And one of the things they asked about that I thought was very powerful, the powerful question is, here you have a diverse cast, you have this amazing, amazing story in Hamilton to tell, but it's still a white story. Where are our stories? Where are our people? Where are in that theater of oppression? And now do we move to liberation? I really think about, am I waiting for somebody in a dominant group to give me permission to do what I need to do within my own community? And how do I decenter white narrative and even decenter myself so that my Black sisters and brothers can hold that narrative, can talk that narrative? And how do I create those intentional spaces of LGBTQ so that I decenter that white narrative and really create a democracy and a governance centering those voices?
Am I allowed to jump in, Mel?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Lali. I appreciate that so much. As a queer psychologist who works a lot in the trans and gender diverse communities, I feel the urgency. I see the people dying by suicide. I see the people dying from other means. I'm seeing people get stripped of gender affirming medical care. I'm seeing things happen right now, and an urgent need for us to not just support them as individual psychologists who support them in a therapy room in that context, but also to leverage some of the power that we have as a profession to disrupt whatever we can disrupt and address the systemic and structural barriers that these communities are really facing right now urgently. That said, the question of urgency for these particular guidelines, a few things come to my mind. One is that competencies are aspirational. Competencies are not scope of practice. This is, if it doesn't pass, it's not going to stop any master's programs from becoming accredited. These are not accreditation standards. These are a set of guidelines for what we think the future of psychology should look like, both at the master's and doctoral level. And as Mel said, if they don't pass, nothing is really slowed down. Like, master's programs are accredited, they are learning, they are, I assume, doing great work. I work in a master's program that is not accredited by APA at this point. It is accredited by a different organization, and they're doing amazing work. We have a lot of master's graduates who are going out and doing fantastic work. We train them to be extremely careful and good and thoughtful. We have a particular model at my institution that is very, very much grounded in social justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and other areas that we find important and we value. So I don't think that the urgency for this particular document feels as weighty to me as the fact that we need to improve the workforce. We need more master's level health service psychologists out there. We need to be accrediting these, so that we need to work on licensure. We need to work on scope of practice, so that we actually get psychology in the conversation when it comes to, as you said, Lali, working with communities which are largely served by master's level practitioners. Right now, we are deferring to social work, and we are deferring to counselor education, and we are deferring to marriage and family therapy. We are deferring all of this work to other disciplines, and we are not asserting the centrality and need for psychology to be right there on the front lines and working with these populations, working with these structures, these systems. And the one other thing I'll add is that I believe, and someone keep me honest here, someone who's more steeped in APA, but I believe association rules at APA say that policies at APA, which, if this is approved, it becomes a policy of APA, have to be revised at least every 10 years. So there is a possibility that this model will be the standing model for the next 10 years, the competency model. This will be it for the next 10 years, which to me means we should be doing it right. We should be, because I don't feel the weight of the urgency for this particular aspirational set of guidelines, and because it will guide the profession in certain ways for the next at least decade. I tend to personally, speaking for myself personally, err on the side of doing it more carefully and doing it more thoughtfully and mindfully and slowing down if we need to slow down, which is an if.
And I think I have an additional thought and a segue, I think, into the final set of questions, because I really appreciate everything that you both have just said, Dr. McCubbin and Dr. Wright. And, I was just talking with a cherished mentor this morning about how I struggle with what feels like very privileged ivory tower problems, when people are suffering and dying and or terrified of everything that's happening, right? And where is psychology in this fighting over ivory tower stuff? And that feels really tough, just speaking for myself personally. And, at the same time, like you're saying, Jordan, we need more people. We need more folks from psychology. And it's really crucial that we strengthen that workforce from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, decolonial perspective, right? Because if we have 1 million more people we add to the workforce, but those 1 million more people are doing harm, then we have enough of a legacy of that. I think about the chronology document that's paired with the apology to people of color for psychology's role in creating and maintaining racial hierarchy in the United States. And do we want, 100 years from now, another companion document like that, where it outlines what all of us did and didn't do to continue to uphold and strengthen white supremacy in this century? Or do we want to tell a different story about how we can use psychology and psychological science and psychological principles to be anti-racist or anti-oppressive and to decolonize this field, and how we can help people from that perspective? And I certainly hope that we choose the latter, that we write a new story this time, and that we come together to realize an anti-racist, anti-oppressive psychology that can help train people to help in a way that genuinely helps instead of doing harm, as we have so often done. And I think that that brings us to the final question, because of course I am not unaware of the context in which I am saying these things, right? And clearly it's on some others' minds who've been patiently waiting for the answers to their questions about the current environment. At least 2 people have asked, how can those of us who train students in red states ensure that we can preserve and maintain the EDI, social justice, and human rights competency? And there's lots of other things about how will APA protect academic freedom. Of course, officially none of us can speak to that per se, although I'm aware of some of the things that APA is doing. And how can, someone else ask, how can we advocate more effectively in this climate, given the potential values that are contrary to EDI? And, some notes, I do want to note one thing. Part of the question that I just asked was about how the large proportion of people that we serve don't hold EDI values, but statistically, that's not actually true. It's easy to look at the electoral map and feel very stressed, but to my recollection, more eligible voters didn't vote than voted. So if didn't vote were, as another mentor put it recently, if didn't vote were a candidate, that candidate would have won. And so it's important to remember, even just from like a not being demoralized standpoint, that, things are not always what they seem. But also when we test just on policy, not on personality, then a lot more things that support human rights tend to carry the day. So it's important to remember that. But nonetheless, legally and systemically, we are in a very difficult position right now, trying to advance work toward human rights. Let's set aside the social justice hot button word for a second. Human rights and ameliorating human suffering, that has now become controversial. So what are folks' thoughts about how we can possibly continue to do that work as psychologists in our current climate and context?
I'll just say briefly, because I know we're out of time, and I think other people can speak to this, I think, better than me. But I think one thing to remember is that, it's not the first time we as a society, as a people, sort of find ourselves in something like this, right? I think there's lessons to be learned, right? From, sort of like, and I'm thinking of sort of Lali, you and your work and your people, right? Sort of who have been dealing with these systems of oppression for far longer than I think a lot of us have been on this planet, right? And so I think that's something to keep in mind. I think there's wisdom in sort of, revisiting history and, surviving, frankly, sort of some eras of atrocities. I'm thinking Jim Crow, I'm thinking sort of things like that, right? I think there's a lot of wisdom in sort of revisiting, right? So kind of sort of how ancestors have dealt with times like these. And then the other piece is that I think it's one of those things, like, now more than ever we need to sort of lean into these principles and these values. It's great when your powers that be are in line with sort of your positionality and values and all that, but that doesn't make it any less important to still try and still speak with people who say, well, like, why couldn't I just sort of have a colorblind attitude about this, and we can sort of point out, well, here are the problems with that, right? So still having conversations, right? But still sort of being grounded in the reality that that doesn't mean we're going to compromise on human rights and our values and things like that. So be quiet briefly so others can speak as well.
Yeah, I can. I will say part of that question that kind of stuck with me, you know, how can we advocate more effectively? And it kind of makes me think, how can we sort of make sure that we're starting from a good spot, right? Like engaging in self-reflection, really identifying where we're feeling called and where our strengths and talents lie. I think we, you know, even though we are in the midst of these things, we also, you know, sort of taking care of ourselves to take care of our community and be in community. And part of that, I think, is reflecting and really identifying where we want to put our focus, and doing that in a way where we can preserve ourselves for the long haul, essentially, of what this might take, and surrounding ourselves with people that can sort of keep us grounded in that and continuing to push forward. So I think that's what's important to me in all of this. And so I feel really lucky, I guess, to sort of summarize that too, to be in company with everybody that's here on the panel that's doing this work, because it's not easy. And I also recognize that we also have some really good privileges that we need to use to continue to improve outcomes for those in our community. So those are my thoughts.
I'll just add in really specifically to this question about how you continue to teach DEI work. My understanding is that there are some states that are sort of forbidding it, but have a carve out for accreditation. So if your accreditation requires it, you can do it. But there are states that forbid it entirely and will continue. We may see more of those. And I actually think that this is going to force an accreditation crisis for APA. And I think that APA is going to have to really think about this. Like, do we soften the EDI requirements for the field of psychology so that we can have accredited programs in these states? Or do we stick with our guns and say, actually, this is core to who we are as psychology, and force that crisis and say, maybe there are some states that are not going to have accredited programs in the short term? I don't know how that would play out. I think it would force some programs to bring it to courts and say, we are going to lose accreditation and have that real conflict. And I think it will force a crisis. But I think we may need to have that crisis at some point. We may need to have that as a discipline and as a country to really decide who we are as a profession, as a discipline of psychology.
And what I hear from that comes back again to, which story do we want to tell? We're at a fork in the road. So 100 years from now, what do we hope that people will write about? Which direction psychology, big psychology, chose at this time? And it's an experience to live through the fork in the road and not know which direction that our beloved profession is going to choose. But that is where we are. And I can't speak for others on this panel or on the screen here, but I am as curious as the rest of you to know which direction are we going to choose? What story are our next generations going to hear and tell about psychology? I think that would be a good thing for decision makers to bear in mind. I didn't mean to end that with the ending of Hamilton too.
Well, we appreciate that, Mel. So thank you for those words. Again, thank you to all of our presenters for your contributions to today's webinar. Definitely appreciated hearing all of your valuable perspectives and for the work that you all are engaged in. For those in attendance, as a reminder, you'll receive information regarding continuing education credits via email within the next 3 weeks. I also want to mention that the recording will be posted on the SEP YouTube page within a few weeks, and I believe the Division 12 will also share some information regarding the recording as well. And finally, be on the lookout for the third webinar within the Advancing Critical Health Service Psychology webinar series, which will be focused on advocacy. More information about that will be coming to you soon. Thank you all for your time and attention, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.